The cornbread arrived on a metal tray at exactly 6:15 in the morning, and Greta Hoffmann stared at it like it might explode. It was golden, crumbly, and still steaming faintly in the cool Texas dawn. The texture looked wrong, coarse and grainy, nothing like the dense rye loaves she'd grown up with in Stuttgart, nothing like the stale black bread they'd been rationed in the Wehrmacht auxiliaries. This was something else entirely, and in the spring of 1945, anything unfamiliar felt like a test. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She sat at the long wooden table in the mess hall of Camp Swift, surrounded by 200 other women who wore the same gray prison uniforms, the same hollow expressions of displacement. The building smelled of pine disinfectant and something sweet she couldn't identify, a strange, almost caramelized aroma that seemed to rise from the kitchen in waves. Outside, the Texas sun was beginning to burn through the morning mist, casting long shadows across the rows of barracks that stretched toward the horizon like fallen dominoes. "What is it?" whispered Liesel Bauer, the young blonde woman sitting beside her. Liesel was 19, barely old enough to have finished her nursing training before the war consumed everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the square of bread, turning it over as if examining a specimen. "It looks like cake." "It's not cake," said Greta, though she had no idea what it actually was. At 32, she'd become the unofficial mother figure of their barracks, the one the younger women turned to when the weight of captivity became too much to bear. She'd been a schoolteacher before the war, comfortable with explaining things. But here in this strange land across an ocean she'd never wanted to cross, her knowledge felt useless. An American guard stood near the door, a young man with red hair and freckles, who couldn't have been more than 22 years old. His name tag read Morrison, and in the 3 weeks since they'd arrived at this camp, Greta had noticed he was one of the kinder ones. He didn't bark orders or slam his rifle butt against the tables when they moved too slowly. "It's cornbread," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the mess hall. "Y'all never had cornbread before?" The German words for what he said didn't exist in Greta's vocabulary. Maisbrot? Cornbread? She knew corn as animal feed, something you gave to pigs and chickens, not something humans ate. The thought made her stomach turn, but hunger was a powerful thing, and they'd learned not to refuse food, no matter how strange it seemed. Beside her, Margarete Schneider, a 45-year-old widow who'd worked in a munitions factory in Dresden, broke off a piece and brought it cautiously to her nose. Her face, lined with grief and exhaustion, softened slightly. "It smells sweet, like honey." "There's butter melted into it," said Liesel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Real butter. I can see it." The 3 women exchanged glances. Real butter. They hadn't seen real butter in years. In Germany, by the end, they'd been spreading lard on newspaper-thin slices of bread, grateful for even that. The lavishness of butter felt obscene, almost immoral given what they knew was happening back home. The bombing, the starvation, the wholesale destruction of everything they'd ever known. Greta lifted the cornbread to her lips and took a small bite. The taste exploded across her tongue in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was sweet, yes, but also savory, with a grainy texture that dissolved into richness. The butter had soaked into every pore in the bread, making it moist and dense. There was something else, too, a hint of salt, maybe sugar, and an earthiness that reminded her of autumn fields and harvest festivals from her childhood. It tasted like abundance, like a country that had never known true hunger. And that realization made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. "It's good," Liesel breathed, and there was wonder in her voice, the kind of wonder that felt dangerous in a prison camp. "It's actually good." Around them, other women were having similar revelations. Some ate quickly as if the bread would be taken away. Others savored each bite, their faces transforming from suspicion to something like gratitude. A few wept openly, overcome by the simple mercy of warm food after months of cold rations and bitter uncertainty. But not everyone was won over. Across the table, Heidi Richter sat with her arms crossed, her cornbread untouched. She was 27, sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it made her temples ache. She'd been a true believer, a member of the BDM since she was 10 years old, and even now, in defeat and captivity, she wore her ideology like armor. "It's a trick," Heidi said, loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. "They're trying to make us soft, make us forget who we are." Greta felt the familiar weight of confrontation settling on her shoulders. Heidi had been trouble since the ship that brought them across the Atlantic, constantly stirring up resentment, reminding everyone of their humiliation, refusing to accept that the war was over and they had lost. "It's just bread," Greta said quietly, meeting Heidi's gaze. "And we're hungry."
"It's propaganda," Heidi shot back. "They want us to think America is paradise, so we'll tell everyone back home. But we know the truth. We know what they did to our cities." The mess hall had grown quieter. Other women were listening now, caught between their hunger and their pride, between the immediate comfort of warm food and the larger questions of loyalty and survival. Morrison, the red-haired guard, had noticed the tension. He shifted his weight, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he didn't intervene. Perhaps he'd been told to let them work things out among themselves. Perhaps he simply didn't understand enough German to know what was being said. Margarete, the widow from Dresden, set down her cornbread with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "My city doesn't exist anymore. They told us when we arrived, Dresden was bombed to ash. My husband is dead. My sons are dead. My home is gone. This bread," she picked it up again, holding it like something sacred. "This bread is the first kind thing anyone has given me in 2 years. I don't care if it's propaganda. I don't care if it's a trick. For one moment, I'm not starving, and I'm grateful." The silence that followed was profound. Heidi's face flushed red, but she didn't respond. She stood abruptly, leaving her cornbread on the table, and walked out of the mess hall with her back rigid and her fists clenched. 3 other women followed her. The hardliners, the ones who still believed they'd been right, that history would vindicate them somehow. Greta watched them go, feeling the familiar ache of division. They were all prisoners here, all displaced and defeated, but they couldn't even find unity in their shared misery. The war had poisoned everything, even their ability to accept mercy. "Eat," she said softly to Liesel, who looked stricken by the confrontation. "Whatever happens tomorrow, today we eat." The younger woman nodded and took another bite, and Greta did the same. The cornbread was still warm, still rich with butter and sweetness, and for a few minutes she let herself forget everything else. She let herself taste this strange American food and find comfort in its simple abundance. Outside, through the mess hall windows, she could see the vast expanse of Texas spreading in all directions, flat land and big sky, so different from the hills and forests of home. Somewhere out there, beyond the barbed wire and guard towers, beyond the ocean they'd crossed in chains, Germany was dying. Her students, those bright-faced children she'd taught to read and write, were either dead or scattered or starving in the ruins. Her sister's letters had stopped coming months ago. Her parents' house in Stuttgart had been bombed 3 times, the last she'd heard. And here she sat, eating cornbread in enemy territory, finding it delicious, and hating herself just a little bit for that simple human weakness. The morning stretched on. After breakfast, they were assigned to work details: laundry, gardening, kitchen duty. The Americans believed in keeping them busy, in maintaining routine and structure even in captivity. It was strange to be treated like dangerous criminals when most of them had been clerks, nurses, radio operators, women who had served in support roles, far from any front lines.
caught in the machinery of war and now paying for it with their freedom. Greta was assigned to the library, a small building near the camp's administrative offices. It was a coveted position, quiet, away from the Texas heat, surrounded by books, even if most of them were in English. She spent her days cataloging, cleaning, sometimes attempting to read the simpler texts with her limited English vocabulary. But today, as she shelved books and dusted surfaces, her mind kept returning to that cornbread, to the way it had tasted, to Margarete's tears, to Heidi's anger, to the fundamental strangeness of being fed so well by people who were supposed to be her enemies. The camp librarian was an older American woman named Mrs. Patterson, a volunteer who came 3 times a week. She had silver hair and kind eyes and spoke no German, but she smiled at Greta whenever their paths crossed. Today, she brought a tin of cookies. Oatmeal raisins, she mimed, pointing at the oats and then at dried fruit. She offered one to Greta with the simple generosity of someone who had never known real deprivation. Greta took this second gift of strange American food, and when she tasted it, sweet and chewy and impossibly rich, she thought about all the things that had brought her to this moment. The decisions, the compromises, the beliefs that had seemed so certain once and now felt like ashes. She thought about hunger and mercy, about cornbread and captivity, about how the taste of something unfamiliar could shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew. And she wondered, as the Texas sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, what other surprises this strange new world held, what other kindnesses or cruelties awaited them, whether any of them would ever truly go home, or if home even existed anymore in any meaningful sense. The cornbread had been a beginning, not an ending, not an answer, just the first taste of a future none of them had prepared for. Sweet and strange and impossible to refuse.
The days at Camp Swift developed their own rhythm, and Greta found herself learning to navigate this new existence, one small adjustment at a time. She woke each morning to the sound of a bugle call at 5:30. Dressed in her gray uniform that smelled perpetually of the harsh American soap they used in the laundries, and joined the silent procession to the mess hall, where breakfast awaited. Often that same golden cornbread, sometimes accompanied by grits, another mysterious American food that looked like wallpaper paste but tasted surprisingly buttery and comforting when topped with the salt and pepper they were allowed. She'd been a teacher of literature and history in Stuttgart's gymnasium, standing before classrooms of eager students, guiding them through Goethe and Schiller, through the romantic poets and the philosophers. She'd loved her work with a passion that made her colleagues tease her gently about being married to her books. And then the war came, and teaching became something else entirely. Propaganda disguised as education, approved texts only, certain questions forbidden, certain truths erased. She'd resisted at first, in small ways, subtle ways, until a visit from the local party official made it clear that resistance, even subtle resistance, would not be tolerated. So she'd volunteered for the Wehrmacht auxiliaries instead, thinking at least she could serve in ways that didn't compromise her soul. She'd worked in communications, translating intercepted messages, helping coordinate supply lines, telling herself that she wasn't really part of the killing machine, that her role was administrative, clean, separate from the violence. It was a lie, of course. She'd known it even then, but lies were easier than the alternative. Now, in captivity, she couldn't escape her choices. They followed her through every moment of every day. The library became her refuge. Mrs. Patterson had taken a particular liking to her, perhaps sensing that Greta had once been an educated woman, someone who understood the value of books, even if she couldn't read most of them. The American woman would sit with her during slow afternoons, pointing at pictures and magazines, teaching her English words with patient repetition. Tree, sky, book, coffee. Simple things,
building blocks of a new language, a new life. Liesel visited her often, seeking company and counsel. The young woman had become almost childlike in her dependence, traumatized by the journey that had brought them here, the Allied bombing raids that had destroyed her hospital, the chaotic retreat, the capture by American forces who hadn't quite known what to do with female German soldiers, the long ship voyage across the Atlantic in cargo holds that reeked of diesel fuel and vomit. "I dream about home," Liesel confessed one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the library floor while Greta organized the returns. "But it's never home as it was. It's always burning. Everything's always burning." Greta paused in her work, looking down at the girl, because that's what she was, really, despite her age. Just a girl who'd been caught in history's teeth and chewed up. "The dreams will fade," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Her own dreams were no better. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" Liesel asked. It was the question they all carried, the one that hung over every conversation, every meal of every moment of forced labor. The Americans had been vague about their ultimate plans. The war in Europe had ended just weeks before their arrival at Camp Swift. Hitler dead, Berlin fallen, Germany divided among the victors. But what did that mean for them? Would they be tried as war criminals? Repatriated? Left to rot in these Texas prisons? "I don't know," Greta admitted. "I don't think anyone knows yet." Margarete was different from Liesel. Harder, more practical. Someone who'd survive by accepting reality rather than fighting it. She worked in the kitchens now, which meant she had access to food in ways others didn't. She'd sneak extra portions to the women in their barracks, a piece of fruit here, an extra biscuit there, small acts of compassion that kept them all from complete despair. She'd told Greta her story one evening after roll call, the two of them sitting on the steps outside their barracks while the sun set in spectacular reds and golds across the Texas plains. Her husband was a teacher too, history, killed in the Russian campaign. Her oldest son was 17 when they conscripted him for the Volkssturm, the desperate last defense of Berlin. She never heard from him again. Her younger boy was 12, killed in the Dresden firestorm along with her mother and father and sisters and everyone she'd ever loved. "I have nothing to go back to," Margarete had said, her voice flat and emotionless. "So this," she gestured at the camp around them, the barracks and fences and guard towers, "this is as good as anything else. At least here, no one is bombing us." The statement had chilled Greta to her core. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. This prison camp, with its strange food and barbed wire and foreign guards, was safer than anywhere in Germany. They were the lucky ones, in a twisted sense. They'd survived. They were fed. They weren't being raped by occupying soldiers or scavenging through rubble for potato peels. The guilt of that realization kept Greta up at night.
But then there was Heidi and her faction, who saw things completely differently. To them, acceptance was betrayal. Comfort was collaboration. The cornbread and the cookies and the kind words from Mrs. Patterson were all part of a sinister plot to break their spirits and turn them into propagandists for American democracy. Heidi had organized what she called resistance meetings in one of the far barracks, gatherings where she and her followers would remind each other of German greatness, of temporary defeat but ultimate vindication, of the need to remain ideologically pure even in captivity. Greta had been invited once and had gone out of curiosity. What she'd witnessed had disturbed her deeply. Women sitting in a circle, reciting old slogans, singing forbidden songs quietly so the guards wouldn't hear, maintaining the fiction that the cause had been righteous and the defeat merely a setback. "You should join us," Heidi had said afterward, cornering Greta outside the latrine. "You're educated. The younger ones look up to you. We need people like you to help maintain discipline." "Discipline for what purpose?" Greta had asked. "The war is over." "This war," Heidi had hissed, "but there will be others, and when the time comes, we need to remember who we are." Greta had walked away from that conversation feeling soiled, complicit somehow just by listening. She'd reported it to no one, not to the American authorities, not to the other women. She'd simply avoided Heidi afterward, keeping her distance, hoping the fanaticism would burn itself out. But it didn't burn out. If anything, it grew stronger as the weeks passed and the reality of their situation became clearer. They were going to be here for a long time, maybe years, maybe forever. And that uncertainty, that lack of resolution, fed both despair and extremism in equal measure. The work details kept them occupied, at least. Greta learned that American routines were different from German ones, less rigid in some ways, more casual, but no less demanding. They expected productivity, but also breaks. They provided water regularly, allowed conversation during tasks, didn't punish minor infractions with brutal efficiency. It was disorienting, this relative leniency, and some women interpreted it as weakness rather than kindness. In the laundry facility, where sheets and uniforms were washed in enormous industrial machines, Greta sometimes worked alongside a woman named Anna Weber, who'd been a seamstress in Hamburg. Anna had nimble fingers and a quick wit, and she developed a strange friendship with one of the American guards, a black man named Jefferson, who'd grown up in Louisiana and spoke with an accent so thick that even the other Americans sometimes struggled to understand him. Jefferson would bring Anna small gifts, a piece of chocolate, a magazine, once a spool of red thread that made her eyes light up like a child's. In return, she'd mend his uniform when it tore, sew buttons back on, make him look sharp for inspections. It was an innocent exchange, Greta thought, two people finding common ground across enormous cultural and political divides. But Heidi saw it differently. She called Anna a collaborator, a race traitor, terms that made Greta's blood run cold because she remembered what such accusations had meant back home. Anna defended herself quietly, saying that Jefferson was just a man doing his job, that kindness didn't have a nationality or a color, that they were all human beings trying to survive. The confrontation had nearly turned violent until Morrison, the red-haired guard who'd first explained cornbread to them, had intervened, separating the women and issuing warnings in his broken German about fighting and consequences. Greta had watched the whole thing unfold with a growing sense of dread. The divisions among them were deepening, not healing. Captivity wasn't bringing them together, it was tearing them apart. Her evenings were spent in the barracks, usually reading. She'd progressed to simple English primers now, children's books mostly, but they helped pass the time and gave her something to focus on besides the uncertainty of her future. Sometimes she'd write letters home, though she had no idea if they'd ever be delivered or if anyone remained alive to read them. She wrote to her sister in Munich, to former colleagues, to students she'd particularly cared about, pouring onto paper all the things she couldn't say aloud. One letter, written 3 weeks into her captivity, began, "Dear Helga, I don't know if you're alive to read this, but I need to write it anyway. I need to believe that somewhere, someone I love still exists and might care that I survived. The Americans feed us well, too well. It feels obscene given what's happening at home. Today we had something called cornbread. It tasted like everything we've lost, sweetness and abundance, and a world that never knew true hunger. I ate it and cried, and I don't know if I was crying because it was good or because I felt guilty for thinking so. How do we live with what we've done, Helga? How do we wake up each morning and pretend we didn't know, didn't see, didn't participate? I was just a teacher, just a translator, just someone trying to survive. But survival required choices, and now I'm learning that choices have consequences that stretch far beyond the moment of making them." She never finished that letter. Some truths were too heavy to commit to paper. Sundays were different from other days. They had chapel services, Protestant and Catholic both, conducted by military chaplains who seemed genuinely concerned for their spiritual welfare despite the language barriers. Greta attended the Protestant services more out of habit than faith. She'd lost whatever beliefs she'd once had somewhere in the ruins of Germany, But the rituals were comforting, the hymns familiar even in this foreign place. The chaplain was a middle-aged man named Reverend Coleman, with gray hair and gentle eyes, and a translator who'd served in Germany before the war. He preached about forgiveness and redemption, about mercy and new beginnings, and Greta wanted to believe him, but couldn't quite manage it. How did you forgive yourself? How did you begin again when everything you'd ever known was ash and memory? After one service, Reverend Coleman approached her directly, through his translator. "Mrs. Patterson says you were a teacher," he said. "We're starting an education program, teaching English to those who want to learn. Would you be interested in helping?" The request surprised her. "I'm a prisoner," she said stupidly. "You're a person," he corrected gently, "with skills that could help others. We're all trying to figure out what comes next. Why not do something useful while we wait?" It was the first time anyone had suggested she might have value beyond her labor, that her education and experience might still matter. The offer moved her more than she wanted to admit. "I'll think about it," she said, though she already knew her answer would be yes. She needed purpose. She needed to feel human again. And teaching had always been her calling, even when corrupted by propaganda and fear. So she became a teacher once more, holding informal classes in the library 3 afternoons a week for women who wanted to learn English. Liesel came, eager and bright despite her trauma. Anna came, wanting to communicate better with Jefferson. Even Margarete came, saying that if she was going to be stuck here, she might as well learn something useful. But Heidi and her followers stayed away, viewing the classes as another form of indoctrination, another way the Americans were trying to erase their German identity. The division felt complete now, irreparable, 2 camps within the camp, those trying to adapt and those refusing to change, those accepting their defeat and those nursing their grievances. Greta found herself caught between them, sympathetic to both perspectives but committed to neither. At night, lying in her narrow bunk, listening to the breathing of 70 other women in the barracks, she'd think about that cornbread again. How something so simple had become so complicated. How a piece of bread could represent everything they'd lost and everything they might still become. How taste could be both comfort and accusation, nourishment and guilt. The seasons changed slowly in Texas, subtle shifts rather than the dramatic transformations she was used to in Germany. Summer arrived with brutal heat that made the barracks feel like ovens and work details almost unbearable. They were given more water, lighter duties during the hottest hours, even the occasional ice chip to suck on, small mercies that Heidi's faction dismissed as manipulative kindness. Greta's English improved steadily. She could hold basic conversations now, could read simple texts, could even help translate during medical appointments when the regular translator wasn't available. Mrs. Patterson brought her books, real literature, Steinbeck and Hemingway and Faulkner, and they'd discuss them as best they could, Greta's halting English meeting Mrs. Patterson's encouraging patience. "You have a gift for languages, for teaching. When this is all over, you could do great things." When this is all over, as if it would ever truly be over, as if they could simply return to normal lives after everything that had happened. But maybe that was the American way, Greta thought. This optimism, this belief in fresh starts and new beginnings. It was as foreign to her as the cornbread had been, but perhaps no less nourishing for all that. The taste of it still lingered, sweet and strange, a reminder that the world was larger than she had imagined, that mercy existed in unexpected forms, and that sometimes survival meant accepting kindness from your enemies and learning to call it something else entirely. The incident with the Red Cross packages changed everything. They arrived one Tuesday morning in late June, Wooden crates stacked in the camp's receiving area, marked with the distinctive Red Cross symbol and the words "Prisoner Relief, Personal Items and Foodstuffs." Word spread through the camp like wildfire. The women gathered near the administration building, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on those crates with desperate hope. For weeks, they'd heard rumors that relief packages were being distributed to POW camps across America. Basic necessities, hygiene items, sometimes even letters from home or personal effects that had been confiscated during capture. The thought of receiving something, anything that connected them to their previous lives sent ripples of excitement through the population. But when the distribution began, the excitement curdled into confusion and then anger. The American commanding officer, Colonel Reeves, a stern-faced man in his 50s who ran the camp with military efficiency but not cruelty, stood on a platform addressing them through the translator, a thin German-American woman named Mrs. Fisher who'd fled Germany in 1938. These packages are being distributed according to documented service records. Those who served in administrative or support roles will receive priority. Those with documented participation in combat operations or ideological divisions will be reviewed individually.
The words landed like grenades. Heidi Richter pushed to the front of the crowd, her face flushed with rage. "This is discrimination! We're all prisoners here! We all have rights under the Geneva Convention!" Colonel Reeves responded calmly, Mrs. Fisher translating his measured words. "The Geneva Convention guarantees humane treatment, adequate food, and medical care. Relief packages are a privilege, not a right. We're following guidelines established by the International Red Cross based on individual circumstances." "Individual circumstances?" Heidi's voice rose to a near shriek. "You mean you're punishing us for our beliefs? For being loyal Germans?" The tension in the crowd was palpable. Some women nodded in agreement with Heidi. Others looked uncertain, caught between their desire for the packages and their fear of speaking against her. Greta stood near the back with Liesel and Margarete, feeling that familiar weight of dread settling over her. Morrison and Jefferson were among the guards surrounding the distribution area, their rifles held at the ready, but pointed down, expressions neutral. They'd been warned this might not go smoothly. Mrs. Fisher continued translating Colonel Reeves' response. "The decision is based on documented roles in war crimes, not on beliefs. Those cleared by the review process will receive their packages. Everyone else will be reassessed on a case-by-case basis." War crimes. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Because they all knew what that meant. Not everyone in this camp was innocent. Not everyone had been a clerk or nurse or radio operator. Some had served in units that had done terrible things. Some had been guards at places whose names were only now becoming known. Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, places where administrative duties had meant something very different from what Greta had done. The crowd began to fragment. Those confident in their records moved forward to queue for distribution. Others hung back, uncertain or afraid. And Heidi's faction began to organize, gathering in a tight knot, voices rising in protest. "This is illegal!" Heidi shouted. "We demand equal treatment! We demand—" "You will demand nothing," Colonel Reeves interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through even before the translation. "You'll accept the conditions of your imprisonment, or you'll face disciplinary action. That's your choice." The standoff lasted for nearly an hour. Heidi's group refused to disperse, standing in the hot sun with their arms crossed, chanting occasionally in German. Old slogans, defiant songs, reminders of an ideology that had brought them all to this point. The guards watched nervously, fingers on triggers, hoping it wouldn't escalate, but prepared if it did. Finally, it was Margarete who broke the stalemate. She walked forward from the crowd directly toward Heidi and spoke in a voice that carried despite its quietness. "My husband is dead. My children are dead. My city is ash. I don't care about ideology anymore. I don't care about loyalty to a regime that fed my sons into a meat grinder. I care about surviving one more day. And if that makes me a traitor in your eyes, then I'm a traitor. But I'm a living traitor, and that's more than most of us can say for our families." She turned away from Heidi and joined the queue for the packages. The moment was electric. For a second, Greta thought Heidi might actually attack Margarete, might launch herself at the older woman in a fury of ideological purity. But Morrison stepped forward then, just one step, just enough to remind everyone that violence would have consequences. One by one, other women began to peel away from Heidi's group and join the queue. Not all of them. A core of perhaps 30 remained loyal to her, remained committed to their resistance, but enough that the demonstration lost its power. Heidi stood alone in the sun, her face a mask of betrayal and rage, and Greta felt almost like pity for her, because Heidi had nothing else. No family waiting at home, no career to return to, no identity beyond the political framework that had defined her entire adult life. Strip that away, and there was nothing left but a hollow shell of a woman clinging to certainty in a world that had proven every certainty false. The distribution took hours. Greta received her package near dusk. A small box containing soap, toothpaste, a comb, 3 pairs of underwear, and a letter from a cousin in Switzerland she barely remembered. No word from her sister, no news from Stuttgart, just the basics of survival and a reminder that somewhere in the world people still knew she existed. Liesel's package contained similar items, plus a photograph. Her parents standing in front of their house in Bremen, smiling at the camera. The house was rubble now, her parents' fate unknown, but she clutched that photograph like it was made of gold. Anna Weber received the red thread Jefferson had promised her, plus sewing needles and fabric scraps, enough to start doing repair work for other prisoners, to create something useful from the materials of captivity. But 30 women received nothing at all. The ones flagged for review, the ones whose records contained red flags that the authorities couldn't ignore. They stood apart that evening during dinner, eating their cornbread and stew in bitter silence, while around them other women exclaimed over small luxuries and precious reminders of home. The division was complete now, absolute, and the consequences rippled outward in ways none of them could have anticipated. That night, someone vandalized the library. Greta discovered it the next morning when she arrived for her teaching duties. Books had been torn from shelves and thrown across the floor. The carefully organized car catalog was scattered like confetti. English primers were ripped in half, their pages fluttering in the breeze from the open door. And on the wall, written in crude letters using what looked like burned wood, was a message in German. Traitors will be remembered. Mrs. Patterson arrived shortly after and stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. All those hours of careful work, all that patient organization destroyed in an act of petty vengeance. Who would do this? She asked, though she didn't expect an answer. Greta knew who had done it, or if not exactly who, then certainly which faction. But she said nothing, because naming names would make things worse, would escalate the conflict into something beyond repair, and she still held out hope, foolish, naive hope, that they might find some way to coexist.
Colonel Reeves thought differently. He ordered a full investigation, interrogations, restrictions on movement. The entire camp was placed on lockdown for 2 days while they tried to identify the perpetrators. No one spoke. The code of silence held firm, even among women who despised what had been done. In the end, they punished everyone. New restrictions were implemented. Earlier curfews, limited recreation time, stricter work quotas. The collective punishment was designed to create internal pressure, to make the women police themselves, since the authorities couldn't extract confessions through force. It worked in a way. Resentment toward Heidi's faction grew sharply. Even women who'd been sympathetic before now turned away, tired of suffering for someone else's ideological purity. But it also hardened the divisions. Heidi and her followers retreated into themselves, forming a tight, insular community within the larger camp. They ate together, worked together when possible, and spoke to outsiders only when absolutely necessary. They became a camp within a camp, maintaining their identity through isolation and mutual reinforcement. Greta found herself navigating an increasingly treacherous social landscape. Teaching became difficult because Heidi's faction discouraged women from attending the English classes. Working in the library meant facing suspicion from both sides, the Americans wondering if she'd report sabotage attempts, the German hardliners wondering if she'd betray them to the authorities. She walked a tightrope daily, trying to maintain neutrality while secretly believing that neutrality itself was a kind of cowardice. The summer heat intensified, turning the barracks into ovens and making sleep nearly impossible. Tempers flared over minor issues, someone taking too long in the latrine, someone snoring too loudly, someone receiving a slightly larger portion at dinner. The small irritations of forced proximity became magnified by exhaustion and uncertainty. And then the news from Germany started arriving in earnest. The American authorities began showing them films, documentary footage of concentration camps, of mass graves, of skeletal survivors, and mountains of corpses. They called them re-education films, designed to confront the prisoners with the truth of what had been done in their names. The first screening was mandatory. All 200 women were marched into the camp's recreation hall and forced to watch as the projector flickered to life and images of unimaginable horror filled the screen. Greta watched Bergen-Belsen. She watched Dachau. She watched American and British soldiers bulldozing bodies into pits while survivors watched with hollow eyes. She watched German civilians from nearby towns being forced to tour the camps, their faces twisted in shock and denial and grief. Some women in the audience vomited. Others wept. A few fainted and had to be carried out by the guards. But most sat in stunned silence, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. Heidi and her faction insisted it was propaganda, that the films were fabricated or exaggerated, that the Allies were creating atrocity narratives to justify their own war crimes. They said it loudly, repeatedly, trying to drown out the evidence with the force of their certainty. But doubt had been planted. Even among the true believers, cracks were appearing. Liesel came to Greta that night, her face pale and streaked with tears. She said, "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. The hospital where I worked, we treated soldiers, just soldiers. I never saw anything like what they showed us."
"I know," Greta said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. How had any of them not known? How had she not known? She'd heard rumors, whispers, stories dismissed as enemy propaganda. But she'd chosen not to look too closely, not to ask uncomfortable questions, because asking questions was dangerous, and she had her own survival to worry about. Margarete's reaction was different. She sat on her bunk that night, staring at nothing, and finally spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. "My husband wrote letters from the Eastern Front. He never said explicitly, but I knew something terrible was happening. The way he phrased things, the silences between words. I told myself I was imagining it, that he was protecting me from military secrets. But I knew. Somewhere deep down, I knew. Anna Weber was more pragmatic. What do they want from us? Confession? Repentance? We can't undo what was done. We can only try to live with it. But could they? Could any of them truly live with the knowledge of what had been done in their names? What their labor and loyalty and silence had enabled? The question haunted Greta through the long, hot nights. She'd lie awake, replaying her life, examining every decision, every compromise, every moment when she'd chosen safety over conscience. She'd been just a teacher, just a translator, just someone trying to survive. But survival had required complicity, and complicity had consequences. The films continued weekly, each one more devastating than the last. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would be carved into history as monuments to human depravity. The authorities were methodical in their re-education, building a case that couldn't be denied, creating a weight of evidence that crushed ideological certainty beneath facts. Some women broke completely. One hanged herself in the latrine using a bedsheet. Another attempted to slash her wrists but was discovered before she bled out. The camp psychiatrist, an American doctor named Brennan, who spoke decent German, instituted mandatory counseling sessions for women showing signs of severe trauma. Heidi's faction began to splinter. The films had been too much for some, too real to dismiss as propaganda. Women who'd been true believers found themselves questioning everything they'd thought they knew. Some came to Greta privately, seeking absolution she couldn't give, asking how to live with guilt and shame. One day at a time, she told them, because it was the only answer she had. You wake up, you eat breakfast, you work, you sleep, and tomorrow you do it again, and maybe eventually the weight becomes bearable. But she didn't believe her own words. The weight never became bearable. It only became familiar. The divisions in the camp shifted again. Now it wasn't just hardliners versus moderates. It was believers versus doubters, those clinging to denial versus accepting reality. Women destroyed by guilt versus women hardened by defiance. Greta found herself counseling women she barely knew, becoming an unofficial therapist because someone had to hold the space for grief and confusion. Lysel needed constant reassurance that she wasn't a monster. Anna needed help processing her worrying relationship with Jefferson, the guilt she felt for finding comfort with a man who'd been designated as racially inferior by the ideology she'd grown up with. Margarete needed someone to witness her memories, to hear about her dead children, to acknowledge that her loss was real even if the cause they died for was false. And through it all, the cornbread kept coming. Every morning, golden and warm and impossibly abundant. The taste of it had become routine now, no longer startling, just part of the rhythm of captivity. But Greta still thought about that first morning, the shock of sweetness, the way such a simple thing had revealed so much about the world beyond their narrow experience. In August of 1945, Greta Hoffmann finds herself in an unlikely place, a prisoner of war camp in Texas, thousands of miles from the ruins of Nazi Germany. A former literature teacher who served as a Wehrmacht auxiliary, Greta is among thousands of German women grappling with defeat, displacement, and a truth too terrible to fully comprehend.
Her journey begins with something as simple as cornbread, that strange, sweet American staple that becomes an unexpected symbol of her transformation. Through the kindness of guards like Morrison and civilians like Mrs. Patterson, Greta encounters a humanity she failed to extend to others during the war. Each slice of cornbread represents not just sustenance,
but the mercy she doesn't believe she deserves. The camp becomes a crucible of reckoning. While hardliners like Heidi Richter cling desperately to Nazi ideology, organizing resistance and threatening those who accept defeat, Greta chooses a different path. She learns English, attends re-education programs, and slowly confronts the uncomfortable truth about her complicity. She wasn't a monster. She was something perhaps more troubling, an ordinary person who looked away when looking became dangerous. The turning point arrives when journalist Samuel Goldstein visits the camp, sharing photographs and stories from Bergen-Belsen. He speaks of Rachel Levy, a music teacher who died of typhus, who remembered the bureaucrats and clerks who processed her deportation papers with pity in their eyes but stamps in their hands. The revelation is devastating. The Holocaust wasn't built by monsters alone, but by countless ordinary people making small, self-preserving choices. Through interactions with farm families like the Hendersons, who lost their son in Normandy, yet still treat German prisoners with dignity, Greta begins to understand that redemption isn't about forgiveness or absolution. It's about accepting responsibility, telling the truth, and spending the rest of one's life trying to be better than what came before. When repatriation finally comes in March 1946, Greta returns to a shattered Germany with a new purpose: to teach the next generation the truth about their history and help build something better from the ruins. The cornbread she once found so foreign has become familiar, a reminder that even in captivity, even in guilt, humanity can persist. This is a story about the long shadow of complicity, the painful work of moral reckoning, and the possibility, however fragile, of transformation. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more narratives that explore the complexities of history, humanity, and hope.